Look closely at a political map of the African continent. And what do you truly see beneath the surface of the carefully printed names and colored boundaries? You see a massive, intricately fractured puzzle of impossibly straight lines, completely unnatural borders, and perfectly geometric divisions that cut violently and arbitrarily through ancient, thriving kingdoms, sacred ancestral lands, and deeply unified ethnic groups. These borders were not drawn by the hands, the history, or the consent of the African people. They were ruthlessly carved into the living flesh of the continent in 1884 at the infamous Berlin Conference, where arrogant European empires sat around a polished wooden table thousands of miles away in a freezing European capital and literally sliced Africa up like a piece of meat on a butcher's block. The entire overarching grand strategy of the colonial project was predicated from the very beginning on a single, universally effective, and devastatingly destructive military and political doctrine: divide and conquer. The colonial empires, with their sprawling intelligence networks and centuries of imperial experience, knew with absolute certainty that a unified, culturally cohesive, and economically integrated African continent would be utterly impenetrable, militarily invincible, and an unstoppable global superpower. So, they intentionally and maliciously fractured the landmass, creating artificial, as inherently unstable nation-states designed specifically to constantly bicker, compete, and wage endless proxy wars against each other over arbitrary resources and engineered ethnic tensions. This deep, systemic, and heavily financed division ensured that the ultimate power, the true geopolitical leverage, would always remain firmly entrenched in Paris, London, and Washington. Even after the superficial, highly televised flags of so-called independence were supposedly raised in the mid-20th century, the exact same invisible, suffocating chains remained firmly and securely in place. The neo-colonial masters quickly realized they no longer needed to send their own expensive armies to enforce their will and secure the flow of raw materials. They simply weaponized regional economic blocs, manipulated local currencies, and infiltrated proxy political organizations to do the bloody and dirty work for them. Organizations like the Economic Community of West African States, widely known as ECOWAS, were originally marketed to the masses as a noble, progressive vehicle for West African economic integration and mutual prosperity. However, over the decades, these institutions were slowly, systematically compromised and transformed into heavily manipulated, fiercely loyal geopolitical enforcement arms for the European Union and the United States of America. Whenever a visionary African leader had the sheer, unforgivable audacity to stand up and prioritize the absolute sovereignty of his own people over the lucrative financial interests of foreign multinational mining corporations, the West did not even have to bother firing a single shot or deploying a single soldier. They simply picked up the phone, called their highly compromised political puppets sitting in the comfortable, air-conditioned offices of ECOWAS, and ordered them to unleash devastating, crippling economic sanctions, permanently close the borders, freeze the sovereign national assets in foreign banks, and literally starve the disobedient, rebellious nation into immediate, humiliating submission. It was a flawless, impeccably evil geopolitical trap designed to ensure that no single African nation could ever successfully break free from the matrix of exploitation, because the very moment they tried to stand up, their own geographic neighbors would be forcefully weaponized to drag them back down into the dirt. This toxic generational cycle of manufactured division, proxy enforcement, and engineered poverty continued entirely unchallenged and seemingly unbreakable until a 34-year-old military visionary named Captain Ibrahim Traoré, decided to permanently, violently smash the neo-colonial chessboard into a million unrecoverable pieces. The breaking point, the geopolitical earthquake that shook the foundations of the Western world, occurred when the patriotic military and the deeply exhausted people of Niger rightfully and decisively overthrew their heavily compromised, Western-backed puppet government. When the old regime fell in Niamey, the neo-colonial establishment in Europe went into a state of absolute, unhinged, existential panic. They did not care about the democratic rights of the Nigerian people. They cared exclusively about the massive, glowing veins of raw uranium buried deep beneath the Nigerian desert. For decades, the entire nation of France had brightly illuminated its cities, powered its massive industrial grid, and fueled its luxurious standard of living using cheap, virtually stolen uranium extracted from Niger, while the people of Niger themselves lived in profound, crushing poverty and overwhelming darkness, seeing their vital, secret energy supply suddenly threatened by a new, sovereign military government, when Paris and Washington immediately activated their ultimate, most destructive fail-safe mechanism. They aggressively pressured, blackmailed, and threatened the leadership of ECOWAS to issue a horrifying, historically unprecedented ultimatum to the new leaders in Niamey. Restore the puppet president to power immediately, or face an imminent, full-scale, devastating military invasion by a combined, heavily armed coalition of West African armies. Let the sheer, sickening reality of that demand sink in. The Western empires were literally ordering African soldiers to march across the desert, to slaughter other African soldiers, to bomb African infrastructure, and to shed African blood, all to protect the uninterrupted, incredibly cheap flow of uranium to European nuclear power plants. It was the absolute, undeniable pinnacle of neo-colonial sick manipulation and psychological warfare. What the generals in Paris and the diplomats in Washington fully expected Niger to instantly crumble under the overwhelming, paralyzing terror of a multi-nation military assault backed by Western logistics and intelligence. They fully expected the entire Sahel region to fall back in line, terrified into total submission by this sheer, brutal display of proxy power. But they catastrophically, historically miscalculated the righteous, unyielding fury of Captain Ibrahim Traoré and his fierce brother-in-arms in neighboring Mali, Colonel Assimi Goita. When the threat of an ECOWAS invasion echoed across the continent, Traoré and Goïta did not sit back in their palaces and passively watch their neighboring brother be systematically destroyed by the agents of the empire. They did not issue polite, meaningless diplomatic statements of concern, and they certainly did not appeal to the deeply compromised, thus perpetually paralyzed United Nations for a peaceful resolution. They recognized instantly, with the cold, calculating clarity of hardened combat veterans, that if Niger fell to a Western-orchestrated proxy invasion today, the sovereign nations of Burkina Faso and Mali would inevitably, undoubtedly, be invaded, dismantled, and destroyed tomorrow. In a move of staggering, when historical defiance that completely paralyzed the military planners in Paris and sent shockwaves of sheer terror through the intelligence agencies of Washington, Traoré and Goïta drew a massive, uncrossable line of blood in the red, unforgiving dust of the Sahel. They stepped forward onto the global stage, stood firmly shoulder to shoulder with the defiant people of Niger, and issued a joint, uncompromising, incredibly aggressive military declaration that echoed like rolling thunder across the entire African continent. Any military intervention, regardless of the scale or the justification, against the sovereign nation of Niger will be considered a direct, absolute, and unprovoked declaration of war against the nations of Burkina Faso and Mali. The message to the West and their regional puppets was crystal clear, brutal, and terrifyingly simple. Touch him, and you die. Yet this was not a sophisticated political bluff designed by public relations consultants. This was not empty diplomatic posturing intended merely for domestic media consumption to boost approval ratings. This was a lethal, fully committed, legally binding promise, backed by heavily armed, fiercely motivated, battle-hardened militaries who had spent years fighting in the absolute most unforgiving combat environments on Earth. Captain Traoré did not just issue a statement, and he immediately authorized the rapid deployment of elite Burkinabe fighter jets, heavily armed combat drones, and mechanized infantry units directly to the borders of Niger. He seamlessly integrated their military command structures and deliberately locked their advanced, newly acquired Eastern weapons systems directly onto the potential invasion routes of the ECOWAS proxy forces. He essentially dared the puppet armies of the West to cross the line, explicitly promising them an apocalyptic, push-grinding, multi-front regional war that would rapidly burn the entire remaining architecture of neo-colonial control to the ground. The psychological shockwave of this historic, unified declaration was absolute and instantaneous. The cowardly political puppets leading the proposed ECOWAS invasion force, men who were perfectly comfortable safely ordering airstrikes from the luxurious confines of their heavily guarded capital cities, but deeply, fundamentally terrified of fighting a real, grinding, bloody war against the hardened, experienced veterans of the Sahel, completely froze in their tracks. The invasion was immediately aborted. The grand bluff of the European empire had been violently, publicly called, and the Western powers were utterly humiliated on the world stage. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré, possessing the mind of a true grandmaster of geopolitics, did not stop there. He knew that successfully repelling a single proxy invasion was only a temporary, a fleeting tactical victory in a much larger, generational war for the soul of the continent. To ensure the permanent, irreversible survival of his people, and to guarantee that the West could never again weaponize African nations against each other, he had to fundamentally, permanently alter the geopolitical DNA of the region. He had to resurrect the deeply buried, violently assassinated dream of true Pan-Africanism, not as a poetic, abstract philosophy spoken in university lecture halls, but as a heavily armed, legally institutionalized, unshakable geopolitical reality. On September 16th, in a moment that will forever be etched into the annals of global history, Captain Traoré, Colonel Goïta, and General Chiani signed the monumental Liptako Gourma Charter, officially and legally giving birth to the Alliance of Sahel States, known as the AES. This was absolutely not a standard trade agreement designed to lower tariffs on agricultural goods. This was not a toothless political forum for polite, endless diplomatic discussion. This was a ruthless, ironclad, heavily militarized mutual defense pact. It was the definitive birth of the ultimate African NATO. The Charter dictates, with absolute terrifying clarity, that an armed attack on the sovereignty or the territorial integrity of any single member state shall be universally considered an attack on all the other parties, triggering the immediate, combined, and overwhelming armed force of the entire alliance to rapidly repel the aggression. By forging this unprecedented brotherhood of blood, Captain Traoré permanently, irreversibly destroyed the 1884 Berlin Conference's master plan of divide and conquer. He took three artificially separated nations, encompassing a vast, incredibly resource-rich, contiguous landmass, significantly larger than the entirety of Western Europe, and effectively, practically fused them into a single, an impenetrable military and economic superpower. If a foreign intelligence agency wants to orchestrate a coup to steal the gold of Burkina Faso, they now have to fight the Malian Air Force. If a European empire wants to illegally sanction the uranium of Niger, they now have to deal with the immediate, overwhelming wrath of the Burkinabe Red Beret Special Forces. They locked their military shields together in an ancient, unbreakable, and incredibly modern phalanx of high-tech weaponry and sheer African willpower. Imagine the sheer, existential, cold sweat terror this highly functional, heavily armed alliance strikes into the very hearts of the Western intelligence agencies and the foreign policy establishments in Paris and Washington. For decades, they comfortably, arrogantly ruled the continent by keeping it weak, isolated, geographically divided, and perpetually impoverished. Now, but they are forced to watch helplessly as a highly disciplined, technologically advanced, and fiercely, uncompromisingly independent geopolitical bloc rises directly from the ashes of their former colonies. But the nightmare for the West does not end with military integration. The AES is rapidly, aggressively moving far beyond mere military defense. They are actively, methodically laying the heavy groundwork for a massive, a unified economic zone that will shatter the financial chains of the past century. They are openly discussing the creation of a shared, entirely independent, gold-backed regional currency that will finally, permanently destroy the deeply parasitic, French-controlled CFA franc, severing the financial umbilical cord that has allowed Europe to siphon African wealth for generations. They are developing a highly coordinated, unified foreign policy that completely and unapologetically ignores the dictates, the threats, and the lectures of Washington and Paris. They are aggressively asserting their sovereign, non-negotiable right to choose their own international partners, forging deep, strategic, and highly lucrative military and economic alliances with Russia, China, and the rapidly expanding BRICS nations, while simultaneously kicking Western military bases, manipulative non-governmental organizations, and deeply compromised foreign media outlets completely out of their sovereign territories. Captain Ibrahim Traoré has not merely become a successful military leader. He has become the living, breathing, heavily armed manifestation of the ultimate Pan-African nightmare that the Western empires tried so desperately, so violently to assassinate alongside legendary figures like Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, and Muammar Gaddafi. Yet he has proven to the entire globe that the artificial borders drawn by dead European kings can be permanently erased by the sheer, unified, uncompromising willpower of a newly awakened, technologically equipped African generation. The corrupt, Western-backed puppets of ECOWAS are frantically panicking, their absolute irrelevance and their cowardly subservience exposed for the entire world to clearly see. The old, so arrogant European empires are rapidly starving of their stolen resources and losing their once unchallenged geopolitical influence across the global south. The Sahel has miraculously transformed from a fractured, bleeding, heavily exploited victim of international terrorism and corporate greed into an unbreakable, towering fortress of absolute African sovereignty. The Brotherhood of Blood has been forged in the fires of Western aggression. The military shields are locked in perfect unison, while the drones are patrolling the United Skies, and the new, unstoppable African empire is rapidly rising in the east, casting a long, terrifying shadow over the capitals of Europe. If you feel the undeniable, earth-shaking, historical power of this Pan-African awakening, if your blood boils at the historical injustices of the past, and you recognize the absolute, unquestionable brilliance of this military and geopolitical masterstroke by Captain Traoré and his allies, but you must immediately break your silence. The digital algorithms of the Western technology monopolies are actively, deliberately designed to suppress this historic revolution, to hide the undeniable truth of African liberation, and to keep the masses utterly blind to the shifting of global power. You must become the active resistance to this censorship. Hit the like button with absolute conviction to force this critical truth out of the shadows and directly into the global feed. And share this massive geopolitical analysis with every single person you know who still falsely believes the outdated, racist propaganda that Africa is inherently weak, perpetually divided, and eternally dependent on foreign saviors. Subscribe to Africa Unchained right now to witness the real-time, undeniable, and glorious dismantling of the neo-colonial empire. Because the old world is dying. The puppets are absolutely terrified. The sacred alliance is permanently sealed in blood. And the absolute final liberation of the African continent has finally, irreversibly begun.